Hello and welcome to The Curator on Monocle Radio with me, Carlotta Rebello. Over the next 60 minutes, we'll be bringing you some of the very best interviews and reports from the past week of coverage on Monocle Radio, with highlights from our studios here at Midori House and also from around the world. This week.
Every morning I've woken up as Prime Minister. I've been inspired by the resilience, the generosity, and the determination of Canadians.
After nearly a decade in power, Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau resigns. Then we talk about security in Switzerland and Europe, hear about the first woman set to lead a major Vatican office, and get the latest from the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. Plus,
during that process, we realized that was a way to kind of pay homage to the book, to not make the film its sort of lesser companion, but to try to see what the medium truly had to offer.
We talk about the new film Nickel Boys, take in the sounds of Tokyo, and recap the Golden Globes. All that and much, much more coming up over the next hour, right here on The Curator, with me, Carlotta Rebello. We begin today with one of the main news stories of the week. After more than 9 years as Canada's Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau announced his resignation in Ottawa. Now the process to succeed him as leader of Canada's Liberal Party and as Prime Minister is getting underway. Monocle's correspondent in Toronto, Thomas Lewis, assesses the outgoing Prime Minister's time in office and began by taking us back to election night.
On election night in Canada back in 2015, Justin Trudeau took to the stage at his victorious party's election night rally and declared that sunny ways, my friends, sunny ways lay ahead for the country that had just voted in Canada's centre-left Liberal Party in a landslide. This, he went on, is what positive politics can do. And at the beginning, Trudeau's personable approach to leadership was undeniably refreshing. It indeed felt as though the curtains had been thrown open to let the daylight back in. Vows to boost immigration, to diversify and grow the national economy, and to reassert Canada's role in the world, all policies that were cheered on at the time, fuelled that upswing both in the national mood and in how others viewed the country from afar. Trudeau's own obvious enjoyment of the spotlight, no doubt honed by his previous career as a high school drama teacher, was also put to use in a variety of ways. He movingly greeted in person the first groups of refugees of Syria's civil war as they arrived at Toronto's International Airport in late 2015. And he also posed for the cameras cuddling a pair of pandas at Canada's National Zoo for good measure. But imagery in politics is a precarious thing to rely on, particularly when a government's image has been intertwined so tightly with that of its leader. When convoys of long-haul truckers blockaded the capital city, Ottawa, back in 2021 to demonstrate against Canada's COVID-19 vaccine mandates, it was Trudeau's name, more than the policy itself, that fuelled their ire. Frustratingly, the debate over Trudeau's future as Prime Minister has clouded a slew of profound issues currently at play in the country. Record inflation, an acute squeeze on housing, stubbornly high prices for daily necessities, as well as an incoming tariff-happy US administration that has Canada already in its sights, and a deeply troubling investigation into widespread foreign meddling by India, China and Iran among them in Canada's national life. The ascent of populist politics on the right in Canada adds to the uncharted territory ahead. Whoever enters the Prime Minister's office next in Ottawa should work to ensure that Canada's gaze doesn't turn inward and find a way to let the sunlight back in.
Switzerland is set to join a scheme which simplifies the movement of military equipment across Europe. Gorana Grikish is Monocle's security correspondent, and she joined Emma Nelson with more.
Well, this is part of the broader changes, obviously, that were offset by Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022. But actually, some of the conversations as well that have been going on prior to that, and some that actually have a lot to do with what went on in 2014 with Russia's annexation of Crimea, of the war in Donbass that was going on for most part of the previous decade. And so basically, we can think about, first of all, the Swiss perspective, which is more of this demand side, if you wish, and then the EU perspective, which is more of the supply side of, who wants what and who is offering what. So from the Swiss perspective, we know from a bunch of Swiss security documents, key security policy documents, that Switzerland actually for the past couple of years has been expressing quite vocally that it wants to intensify security policy cooperation with the likes of the European Union and NATO, but in a way that it could still maintain, obviously, its policy of neutrality, which is sacrosanct, which is part of both sort of the political culture and tradition, as well as being codified in key legal documents. And then from the EU perspective, given that we are talking now about this particular PESCO deal, and PESCO stands for Permanent and Structured Cooperation in Security and Defense. This is something that in EU was established in 2017. So again, something that predates the full-scale Russia's war in Ukraine, but is connected obviously to the tectonic changes that have been occurring on the European continent as a result of annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass, where basically European Union states agreed that they would jointly develop their defense capabilities and jointly conduct armament projects to basically be more capable in the space of security and defense. And this is then where we get to your question about what it is that Switzerland is doing at the moment. So what we will actually see today on the agenda of the Council of EU when they meet in Brussels is essentially one point which just confirms something that the Swiss Federal Council, or the Bundesrat, already approved back in August, and that is that Switzerland would be part of the military mobility project. This project is something that the European Union has been very much focused on, again, as part of the 22 Russia's war in Ukraine, because EU really wants to make itself more secure. And one way of doing that is to actually ramp up infrastructure to better ensure that military assets can be transported, that they're mobile across the bloc, whether it's a movement of troops or military equipment. European Commission, ever since the end of 22, has been working on a plan to better connect and protect its infrastructure.
You're listening to The Curator on Monocle Radio with me, Carlotta Rebello. A woman has been appointed to head a major Vatican office for the very first time. Pope Francis has named an Italian nun, Sister Simona Brambilla, to become prefect of the department responsible for all the Catholic Church's religious orders. This comes in the same week that the pontiff criticized nuns with vinegar faces and called on them to avoid gossip. Well, for more on all of this, Monocle's Georgina Godwin was joined by former Vatican correspondent Juliet Leanley.
This is the kind of person who often comes up with sort of surprising decisions, statements, and we'll talk about the vinegar faces later. So there definitely was no sign on the outside that this appointment was in the making. There are 4 women who hold high spots within the Roman Curia, which is the Vatican's administrative and governing body. But this is the first woman in history to head up a major dicastery. Now, the dicastery, there are 16 of them, and it's the equivalent of what you would call a ministry. Let's put it that way. So 59-year-old Simona Brambilla is the first woman prefect at the Vatican, and she takes over the reins of the dicastery that oversees, as you said, consecrated lives. So every religious order, priests and nuns all over the globe, Georgina, and including newer movements, as well as the better known, let's say, Jesuits and Franciscans. Now, just for a little bit of background, Brambilla trained as a nurse before becoming a nun, and she worked in Mozambique as a missionary for many years, holding several leadership positions. But, and there is a but, Georgina, while she indeed has, if you want, cracked the glass ceiling by getting appointed prefect, at the same time, the Pope has named a pro-prefect as co-leader. and he's male. Now, why do you think he did this? Well, because as prefect of a dicastery, stay with me, you need to be able to say mass and have other, let's say, sacramental functions, which as a woman, Brambilla obviously could not. So enter Cardinal Ángel Fernández. He's a 64-year-old Spanish cardinal who spent many years in the Pope's home city of Buenos Aires. So as one Vatican insider told me, this is a bit confusing and a lot of politicking, Georgina, and perhaps it's not surprising, however, because it is Pope Francis that we're talking about.
So, I mean, she has the title, but she has to share the job with a man. It is, though, a hopeful sign that the Catholic Church is moving towards gender equality?
Well, let's note that it was Francis himself who reformed the Holy See's constitution to allow women and lay people to head up dicasteries. So that's important to note. But Georgina, things move very, very slowly within the Catholic Church, as you can imagine, given its many, many centuries of history. And you still hear so many complaints that women are very much considered, let's say, second-class citizens within the Church and at the Vatican. And this despite doing the lion's share of the Church's major work, let's say in hospitals, in schools. So often it's the nurses who are there teaching or taking care of patients. And to this day, although the Pope is very forward-thinking, if you want, with regard to women's roles, he has said on numerous occasions that Church is not ripe for female priests or even deacons. And I mean, the Roman Curia is only made up by 26% of women. So only 1 in 4 members of the Curia are female. So it's still very much a hot-button topic, Georgina.
Now, let's go to his extraordinary comments about nuns having vinegar faces and gossiping.
So the Pope's remarks came just a few days ago, and he was talking to a group of nuns. He was calling on them to be open and brave and friendly. And he said he was calling out on them not to gossip, saying that gossip kills and poisons. So he said, convey joy. And vinegar is ugly. So making reference to maybe sour faces that could often seen, especially perhaps in stereotypes, old-fashioned stereotypes of nuns. But this is so Francis, isn't it, Georgina? He's known for his sort of, let's say, lack of tact. And often he's outspoken. You've got to pity his press office, because so often they're really sort of trying to catch up with what he's saying and trying to rectify what he says. And as he gets older, Georgina, it's not getting any better. Let's put it that way. I mean, let's say, for instance, just last June, he famously used a Roman slang term, frociaggine. It's a really ugly term, and it's a homophobic slur. I'm not going to tell you what it translates as, but you can imagine. And while speaking to Roman priests, he used it. And his point was that gay men should absolutely be welcomed into the church, but perhaps not necessarily into seminaries. Now, you can imagine the Pope's spokesman, Matteo Bruni, he responded saying there is room for everyone in the church. The Pope never intended to offend or express himself in homophobic terms, and he apologizes if he caused offense. There's so much crisis communication going on behind the scenes, Georgina. But, you know, as a parent, you'd be mortified if your child used that kind of language. So for the Holy Father to use it, the optics aren't that good, Georgina.
Now, the Consumer Electronics Show kicked off in Las Vegas this week. Monocle's technology correspondent David Phelan was on the ground, and he joined Emma Nelson with more.
What's interesting this year is that for the last few years post-COVID, Las Vegas has been what it is, but the Consumer Electronics Show has been very quiet. This year, it's sort of come back with a vengeance. It's every single corridor you walk down has been jammed with people tripping you up with wheelie bags, and it's hard to get through anywhere. So it feels like CES has really come back.
That doesn't sound like much fun, especially with the wheelie bags, but it does sound quite exciting nonetheless. What is it that's caught your eye?
I think there's been a real emphasis, unsurprisingly, on artificial intelligence. That's still the buzz phrase, and lots of companies are putting it into every product. Even bird feeders now have artificial intelligence. Even, unbelievably, there's been a vacuum cleaner, a robot vacuum cleaner that has an arm that comes out of it that can recognize a sock that has been left on the floor by an unruly teenager, and it can pick it up and put it into a different thing. So that's been a big thing. Sustainability has also been a big emphasis. Panasonic, who had the keynote address today, they were very keen to express that nothing is more important now than sustainability, it seems. Panasonic, who had the keynote, were very keen to impress upon everyone that recycling is just as important as making new, that products should be fixable instead of just thrown away and replaced.
And how much will a market which has set itself on a course of, if it breaks, replace it immediately, how much is the market likely to listen to that kind of call?
Well, that's a really good question. And I've asked people in lots of major companies about this before. And I say, you always go on about how green you are, how sustainable things are, but you come out with a new product every year that you want me to buy. And more they are saying we are making things so that they can be repaired, or we are making them to last longer, or we don't want you to buy them every year, but we are making new products as well. So it is definitely a tension that they have not yet resolved.
Let's talk about the television, which is something that we are all asked to replace every 5 minutes. But it all depends on what new technology is inside. What developments have we seen in Las Vegas this year?
I mean, it's an iterative development, always with TVs. Things just get bigger, that's for sure. There's Samsung's 115-inch television that they were boasting about today. And that's very interesting. Panasonic had a great new TV with upward-firing speakers, which had previously sat on the back of the set. Now they're built into the top of it, so it's a much sleeker design. The upward-firing idea is that it bounces the sound off the screen and then off the ceiling, and then it gives you a surround sound effect. But, more and more, size is everything, it seems. Apart from the Samsung ones, every other OLED screen is getting bigger, and new technologies such as mini LED are coming in more and more, and those are providing screens that are not glossy in the same way, which is great because you get less reflectivity. And Samsung had the Frame Pro. This is a screen that is flat to the wall, looks like a piece of art when it's not showing you TV, and now it is wireless, not for power, but in order to connect streaming services and so on, everything is done wirelessly. So that was a major introduction, I think, this year.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
You're with The Curator, our weekly highlights show here on Monocle Radio. I'm Carlotta Rebello. We turn to the world of entertainment now, as this was a week marked by the 82nd edition of the Golden Globes. The event marked the first major ceremony of the Film Awards season. Film critic Karen Krzanovich joined Georgina Godwin with the results.
They started in 1944, and they've had that huge scandal in 2021 where they had to revamp completely. And now they've got over 300 members from 76 countries. And generally, these are foreign journalists, foreign meaning not American. And so the big difference is that the Oscars, this is not a forerunner. The Golden Globes are not a forerunner for the Oscars, because the Oscars are a hometown, industry-based, although global awards. This is really more of, as I said, foreign journalists picking out their favorites.
And it's also across television, and it doesn't honour people like screenwriters or rather cinematographers and that sort of thing.
No, it isn't. It isn't big on tech. It's big on sort of popularity and what people watch.
All right. So what have we been watching? Who are the big winners?
Well, the big winners are sort of predictably, I don't want to say esoteric, and I don't want to say not fun to watch, but I mean, the ones that are chosen are the ones that sort of poke you in the eye a little bit. Okay, the best film drama was The Brutalist, which is a beautiful film made on a really small budget and is really a bum number, I have to say, because it's really, really long. It has a. I'm not going to go on and on. The best, I'd love to, though. It does have an intermission at the wrong place, but don't get me started. Emilio Perez won his best film comedy musical, and that is a musical about a Mexican cartel chieftain who becomes a trans woman. Surprise! Okay, but Zoe Saldana won for it, which is, I think, Best Supporting, which is absolutely amazing, and I'm really pleased about that. I'm not sure where else you want me to go. Adrien Brody won Best Film Drama Actor, and that is again for The Brutalist. And as Nikki Glaser, who is the host tonight, the first woman to host the Golden Globes, said tonight, two-time Holocaust survivor Adrien Brody, because of course the piano.
Dear, oh dear. Tell us about Nikki Glaser in the role of host.
She is incredible. She is really incredible. She said she's done this performance 93 times, and she was really brilliant. She's a stand-up comedian. She's noted mostly for roasts. She's very confident. I mean, she looks great. Her delivery is amazing. And she just doesn't flinch. You know, she's got a really steely eye. But some of her comments were just absolutely incredible, really funny. And, you know, Ricky Gervais, who didn't get the gig this year, tweeted two of the things that he would use. And, you know, the difference between Nikki Glaser and Ricky Gervais is that Nikki really kept it on the funny, razzy side, where I think that Ricky Gervais is taking somewhat of an older line.
Tell us about his brother, Kieran Culkin.
Ah, yeah. Well, he was great in Succession, and he has made this sort of two-hander with Jesse Eisenberg called The Real Pain, which is about visiting their Jewish roots in Poland. And it's a comedy, and it's very, very lightweight, but it was really lovely to see, and we know that Kieran Culkin can really act, and he goes beyond what we saw him in as Roman Roy, the unusual son in Succession. And it was lovely. I mean, the Culkins are a great acting family, and I think it's great to see him get this. In particularly tough circumstances, he went against Jeremy Strong, Guy Pearce, Edward Norton, and Denzel Washington.
Now, last year we saw The Bear sweep the board. Yeah. Did that happen again?
Well, The Bear won best comedy acting. No, sorry, it was best. I think it might be best comedy acting actor. But the third series was not as welcomed, and it was very unusual and esoteric. And I think that it's. I'm surprised that it actually won anything this year, to be quite honest. And this is typical of the Golden Globes, that they'll pick up on things that resonate in ways that the Oscars never would.
The Japanese-American epic Shogun
did very well.
It did, didn't it?
Did very, very well. Yeah, which is lovely. And again, this reflects the Golden Globes' international viewpoint. I mean, granted, it was very popular with domestic viewers. I mean, American viewers really loved it. But to give these sort of nods to actors that we wouldn't ordinarily see is really one of the strong points of the Golden Globes.
Only Murders in the Building, which I have to say I've been disappointed with the later series.
Yeah,
that was nominated for 4 awards. So did it pick them up?
Well, I'm primarily focusing on films.
Yeah.
So I know that Selena Gomez was there with her new boyfriend, and Nikki Glaser points out that he was only given this wish by a great genie, and that was a bit naughty, but that's typical of her.
The Argentine architect Emilio Ambas approaches a discipline by seeking harmony between artificial buildings and the natural world. Subterranean floors hidden within the earth itself, or structures hidden amongst verdant foliage, are just some of the ways in which the designer has made his philosophy a reality across the globe. Green Over Grey is a recent documentary about Emilio's work. Monocle's Maylie Evans spoke with one of the film's co-directors, Francesca Molteni, and began by asking what drew Francesca to create this documentary on Emilio.
I was born in Chaco, the subtropical province of Argentina.
Let's say that Emilio has many different skills, and he's so able to fulfill every commitment. He is a curator, a designer, an architect, a writer. So to me, he's a little bit like Joe Ponti in Italy. He is a master in many different fields, and this is a little bit unique. Above all, he is also a great, let's say, character. He can be very funny, very open, but also able to say no if he doesn't like the project, the idea, or the person. When I went through the text, the writings, the books by Emilio himself, I discovered that more than 40 years ago, he was already thinking about, let's say, a new harmony to design between human beings and building and constructions. For him, the way he was able to express this metaphor is poetic, but is also very, very pragmatic in terms of buildings, constructed buildings, and in terms of text. The message is a message of reconciliation between the natural realm and the artificial world.
And I wondered if you could talk to me about this idea of fables, because I guess a manifesto is often the format that architects use to sort of declare their way of looking at the world and their role within it. But with Emilio, it really struck me this idea of storytelling, of fables. Yeah. So could you tell me a bit more about why that is so much more fitting, and I guess working on this project, how this snuck into the finished film?
He started writing fables more than 50 years ago. It's not just another way to express things. It's not just a literary accessory. The subtext of a fable, which is really what interested Emilio, is a ritual. This is the way he also conceived his architecture. It's not just to defeat bad conditions on the earth, but it's also to make it possible for human beings the rituals of every day, like eating, loving, staying together, sleeping. This idea of not being ideological some way, but to express all his theories through a fantastic imagination. Since human beings are there, we're telling fables to our family, to our friends. So it's a very specific and intimate way to talk about architecture as well.
My room opened directly onto the leafy branches of a tree that was on the street. I was entranced by that tree.
The Akers Fukuoka building in Fukuoka, Japan, is really the manifesto of his green over grey architecture. He decided to give back the amount of land that was somehow stolen to the city by building this new prefectural building, and to give back through a public park that you can really climb to the end of the building, where you have a fantastic view of the city and the landscape and the mountains around. And many years ago, these trees that are really covering the pyramid of the Akers Fukuoka building were just very, very little trees, plants. And now when you climb that building, you are in the middle of a forest, in the middle of a city. And this is unique. We met people that are every day, they have their walk at 8 in the morning, they're just walking there and start the day with that fantastic nature environment around.
You do have the insights of gardeners working with these sites day in, day out. And as you say, the citizen who is climbing these steps day to day, and that's part of his routine. Why was it really important to have these points of view included in the mix?
We always try to get architecture alive through the people that are really living or passing by that building every day, entering and crossing. And architecture is for human beings. Is not just a nice gesture. Is a way to help people to feel more comfortable in a constructed building. The point of view of the gardeners, the people taking care, also because nature is changing every day, every season. So you need someone really, and taking care is one of the key points, I think, of Emilio's philosophy as well. He designed these buildings thinking about people that would one day, and community and cities that would really be the owners of this building.
He was always incorporating the environment into the building. he tries to imagine how he can create an extraordinary extra gift in his architecture.
Realmente yo pienso que él está buscando como ese paraíso perdido.
One of the challenges of this documentary was that Emilio asked not to be interviewed in the film. So first of all, we had to think about communicate his way of thinking, his philosophy, his poetic through the buildings. When you meet Emilio, he's always suggesting this strange point of view. He's not the person that you are used to as an architect. He's always trying to ask you to do something different. That was a little bit the starting point. How can we reflect in the film his personality? And secondly, we had a special encounter also with the models. So the models that Emilio did for all these projects and buildings are not the typical architectural models. They are more, again, paintings. They reminds us a little bit Matisse or paintings from Magritte, for example. They are not so technical, but they are fables as well. They are able to tell you a story. Not through technical details, but through the idea that they can suggest you how these buildings are really buried into the green and how you can transfer this very strong encounter between human beings and nature. So we tried in the film to film the buildings in a way that we could recollect the models. In the studio where we filmed the models, we used the same lights that is changing during the day, giving a different perspective on the buildings from very early morning and the sunrise, and all the light and the context around the buildings are changing also the visual part of the buildings. This was really possible also because we are together with Mattia Colombo, the other director. We tried to tell another story. Otherwise, Emilio would have not been satisfied. When you have Emilio Ambatz in mind, you think more about the designer and the curator. So this new perspective of such an important statement on architecture and his prophetic view is for many people really a discover. So first of all, I'm happy to help this different vision of Emilio Ambatz to become a more global and internationally well known. This is to me, first of all, one very strong feeling.
It's time now for a highlight from this week's edition of Monocle on Culture. Monocle's Sophie Monaghan-Coombs sat down with director Ramel Ross to talk about his new film about nickel boys.
You know, it feels not only incredible, but kind of the most type of rewarding because, as you know, like the rules of the film, the intention of the film comes from such a sort of organized and integrity-filled place that you know you're sacrificing a bit of traditional communication with the audience in order to kind of make a statement for cinema and a statement for the Dozier boys. And so it's incredible. Like, no one's typically rewarded for, you know, doing work that has a bunch of meaning.
Yeah, as you say, that must feel so satisfying. It's both the subject matter is so meaningful, but also some of your formal choices, which I hope we'll get onto and talk about. So yeah, I'm very pleased that it's had the reception that it has so far because I thought it was amazing. And I wanted to ask about the source material. This film is based on the Pulitzer Prize-winning novel Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead, who's actually someone who we've had on Monocle on Culture before, and he's just the most incredible interviewee. And I wanted to ask you, when you were with the book, how you sort of thought about what you wanted to take from it and also how you wanted to change some of what was in it or make it your own as you translated it into the film.
Yeah, my co-writer and I were, maybe as expected, but deeply intimidated by the prospect of adapting the book. You know, after you read it and then you read it again and then you read it again, you realize it actually doesn't lend itself to adaptation. It's so, for lack of a better word, perfect. It has its ecosystem of meaning is so concise. I think what we did, it needed a sort of distillation. It needed to be sort of purged and reduced to its essence, and then kind of taking that essence over to the new medium and seeing what the medium wanted to do with that. That was how we proceeded. And I think during that process, we realized that was a way to kind of pay homage to the book, to not make the film its sort of lesser companion, but to try to see what the medium truly had to offer, Coulson's kind of masterpiece.
Yeah, it really feels like something completely new, and there are so many choices. Maybe we can start off with the point of view, which obviously lots of people have talked about, but it is so striking and it's such a bold choice. Maybe you can talk about that decision to film from that first-person perspective.
Yeah, the point of view was a decision that is multifaceted. It serves idea of giving life and giving vision to Coulson's characters, to the Dozier School boys, who Coulson's narrative is about, essentially. It also allows the audience to share in their vision and in their experience. And I think that's where the real kind of breakthrough is that point of view, if you approach it more along the lines of how vision feels as opposed to what vision is, and you approach using the camera kind of as an extension of consciousness. If you can align the audience's experience of meaning making and the visual field with the characters, then you're allowing yourself to be in the world and not see the world while they're doing things, like not watching their behavior, but experiencing it simultaneously.
Yeah, and it works so well because you are seeing most of the story from the main character's point of view, and it feels very subjective, but you're always aware that the story is a wider one. It's not just about these two people. It's about a whole system and a much wider historical context. And you talked earlier about distilling the essence of Colson Whitehead's book and then building it back up into a new thing, into a new medium, both with the point of view and also how you move around in time, and also your use of documentary footage. I wonder how all of those different elements, it feels like you had a lot of freedom as a filmmaker. I wonder if it felt a bit like that. There's a lot going on, but it all kind of perfectly fits into the story that you're trying to tell.
Yeah, there is a lot going on. And I think one of the there's so many core things to the film, as you're implying. It's really just full of ideas. One thing that Jocelyn and I wanted, Jocelyn Barnes is the co-writer, also a producer on the film, but one thing we wanted to do was to make sure that Coulson's narrative was connected to the larger kind of ongoing cultural conversation around race, around visuality. You realize that in order for the Nickel boys and the Dozier School boys to be treated the way that they were treated by those who ran the school, but also those who, it's tough to call it a school because it wasn't a school at all. And those in the community, they need to be seen a certain way. They needed to be, it's part and parcel with the visualization of people of color over time. And so we kind of set out to find images that could offer not only a peek into the way that folks had been captured by cameras in different archives, but also the different modes of production that have sort of produced notions of Blackness. And the documentary element, I think, exists if you're kind of using any archival footage. It just feels like it's nonfiction or it's documentary. But using the Dozier School boys' images themselves and a lot of forensic images from the Dozier Report, which was done by the University of Southern Florida, that's kind of where this sort of aching truth is built into the film.
Now, what does a city sound like? Does its soundscape evolve over time, just as its architecture does? Contributor Alexander Strelkova sent us this report exploring the sounds that shape Tokyo.
If you've ever taken a ride on the Tokyo Metro, chances are you'll remember the contagious tunes as the trains prepare to depart. These are the Hasha melody, departure melodies first introduced by the Japan Railways in the 1970s. With the bubble economy then in full swing, its overcrowded stations were often witness to chaos and accidents. So the idea was born to design short jingles to instill a more relaxed commuting atmosphere. A few years later, it was the jazz musician Minoru Mukaya who, commissioned by the JR East Train Company, transformed the departure melodies into something of an art form. Lasting anywhere from 2 to 15 seconds and primarily featuring soft bells and synths, he composed a unique short melody for each station, more than 170 in total. Mugaya had previously gained fame as the pianist for the popular band Cassiopeia and is also a dedicated train enthusiast. Considering that nearly 7 million commuters use the Tokyo Metro every day, this technically makes him one of the most listened to musicians in the world. Over time, his tunes became something of an urban legend in itself. On the Tozai line, the snippets form an entire song in each direction if you play them together. On the Yamanote line, jingles help create a sort of sonic sense of place through a playful nod to a particular trait of each neighborhood. So, if you get off at Takadano Baba, you'll be greeted by the cheerful theme of Astro Boy, a tribute to the birthplace of the celebrated manga character. And in Ebisu Station, once home to the eponymous beer brewery, you'll hear a tune from the brand's old advertisements. Beyond the quirkiness, departure melodies form an integral part of Tokyo's soundscape. Sound is basically ubiquitous, blaring from shopping arcades, train stations, public toilets, pedestrian crossings, ramen shops, vintage clothing stores, pharmacies, and even just random spaces like streets and alleyways. A birdsong chirps alongside traffic lights to guide persons with low vision, adding to the cacophony of ambient noise and commercial announcements that spill through the public space. Whether these are delivered through loudspeakers, enthusiastic staff calling out to passers-by, or that larger-than-life 3D cat jumping off a giant LED screen in Shinjuku, the unrelenting soundscape of late capitalism is as integral to Tokyo as its gardens, shrines, or izakayas.
Nakajima Yoshimichi, a Japanese philosopher, described Japan in that way as a sound-saturated society, what's referred to as otozuke shakai in Japanese. And it really refers to the idea that I think it's particular to the cities, the major cities, and Tokyo in particular. Your everyday movements are just constantly being sort of announced and guided by sound. So whether it's these melodies on the subway platform, crosswalk jingles that are automated, political announcements that are blaring through loud, distorted loudspeakers because the volume is so intense, the sort of constant ubiquitous background music, even to the level of public restrooms where it's quite common to have white noise machines, inside the stalls. And, I think that gets at the core of this sort of almost sense of like overflow or saturation of sound.
Lorraine Plord is the Associate Professor of Media Studies and Anthropology at Purchase College State University in New York. In her research, she focuses on how Tokyoites engage with various sonic environments within the city, and in particular, with the ubiquitous background music, or simply BGM. Turns out, no sound is an accident. What may seem like a frenetic blend of public announcements and catchy melodies is, in fact, a meticulously curated sensory landscape shaping how people live, work, and consume.
One of the things that I researched during my fieldwork was how the government was trying to kind of use sound and use music as a way to, ultimately kind of reduce stress on workers. So the company Yusen, which is really the main sort of company that provides background music for Japan, they funded an initiative, a program essentially that companies could subscribe to play background music, streaming background music in the offices. And while these white-collar offices are usually not spaces that have background music, I think the idea with this was that there was a sense of increasing stress on workers and work-life balance and kind of the fears and anxieties over overworking in Japan, which has been around for many years. And there was this idea that sound or music in this way could be used to kind of manage the workers and ultimately provide a kind of sense of healing for them, as a way to kind of manage their stress and their anxiety. But again, this sort of underlying logic is the idea of ultimately making them more productive, because the implicit idea here is that if their workers are happy and calm, then they'll be more productive and more efficient. So there is a sort of insidious kind of undercurrent underlying using music as a tool in this way for productivity.
BGM is seen as a kind of low art, similar to muzak or elevator music, a practice of which the British musician and producer Brian Eno famously offered a scathing critique. Although it's been in use since the early post-war era, today, companies such as USEN operate much like a streaming service, offering subscriptions for both individuals and businesses. In retail spaces, it is carefully deployed to craft an atmosphere that subtly nudges consumers to spend more or to stay longer. While many shops and cafes rely on BGM to curate their sonic environments, its omnipresence isn't without raised eyebrows.
For the most part, it's generally tolerated. I don't think people even really see it as something necessarily dramatic or remarkable. I think it's just an important sort of facet of Tokyo's soundscapes. But I think it definitely has, can be seen as kind of a tool for manipulation on some level, especially when it's tied to commerce. You mentioned Brian Eno, and I think his ambient music manifesto gets at these questions. His notion of ambient music was diametrically opposed to how background music is being deployed in Japan and elsewhere. And his main critique was that it was Muzak, and he was specifically referencing the Muzak company. His critique was that it was just solely existing as a means to sell a product and to make people feel a certain way in a kind of very manipulative way. Whereas his notion of ambient music was about allowing the listener to kind of respond in whatever way they felt.
Beyond BGM, there's another catchy staple of Tokyo's soundscape, its distinct brand jingles. These are often inspired by, or sometimes directly borrowing from, familiar tunes ranging from American folk songs to the Beatles' Help. In fact, the latter has been cleverly repurposed as a cue to summon extra assistance for overwhelmed cashiers at a local supermarket chain. Or take Bikugamera, the electronics giant that opened its first store at the north exit to Ikebukuro Station in May 1978. Its jingle draws inspiration from the 19th century American hymn Shall We Gather at the River, and its lyrics pay homage to its home turf and the nearby Tobu and Seibu department stores. To close the ultimate imaginary soundscape loop, this March, the jingle was adopted as the official departure melody for the JR Yamanote line at Ikebukuro Station, firmly cementing its place in the city's oral identity.
I've lived in Tokyo for nearly 5 years now, and I've been visiting for a lot longer than that. And, I'm still, to this day, recording. I'm still kind of, whenever I go anywhere, I'm kind of obsessed with the soundscape of the city. And so I think for most people who aren't as otaku as me, maybe, they might just kind of just ignore these kind of background sounds. But to me, it's one of the things that makes the city so interesting and so great.
Nick Luscombe is a British DJ, music curator and broadcaster who in his work explores the intersections between sound, architecture and the urban environment. In 2010, he founded Musicity, a platform to facilitate a dialogue between architects and the city on one hand, and musicians and sound artists on the other. What started as an art project gradually evolved into an innovative platform that creates site-specific works inspired by various architectural and urban spaces. Based in Tokyo since 2020, Nick works with architects as well as developers, recording sounds of the spaces they create and suggesting ways how to improve the sonic aspects of the city. Each city has its own distinct soundscape, a peculiar collection of emblematic sounds that together weave its unique urban fabric. But why is sound so important yet so overlooked when it comes to the built environment?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, as a kind of sound obsessive, I'm always surprised that sound is still considered with very little importance, and I guess we can't help the fact that we're very, as creatures, we're quite visually inspired rather than sonically, at least on the surface. And so obviously every time you see a new development or a new building, you might see a model of it or a 3D render, but what you never do is hear anything. And I think there is a responsibility in a way when people design cities to kind of design them visually, to make them look good, obviously visually, but also to make them sound good. And I think it is overlooked. And I guess it's just a case of, at the end of the day, it's probably to do with budgets. It's probably harder to convince someone with money to pay for a city that sounds good when you can just make it look good. And that's pretty much the job done. So I think it's that battle that people working in sound always have. It's just sound is always the second best, I think, to a lot of people.
Most of us rarely consider the role that sound plays in forming our perception of what constitutes a desirable living environment. When urban sound does come into focus, it's typically through the narrow lens of noise control and regulations aimed at keeping the decibels down. Sure, excess noise or sound exposure can indeed cause health issues such as increased heart rate or tinnitus. But in a fast-paced, often stressful environment, auditory cues can also guide, soothe and reassure. I ask Nick if there is a way to improve our awareness of sounds around us.
I think it's just a case of education. I mean, what I'm doing spending a lot of my time at the moment is taking people like students, families, older people as well, into spaces and just kind of encouraging them to listen, based on the kind of Pauline Oliveros deep listening concept. And by listening to spaces, we can kind of genuinely connect to them on a better level. We can connect to communities much more through kind of the day-to-day sounds around us, or by music or spoken word or voices or dialects. It's so deep, as Pauline Oliveros would have said. But for me, it starts with that. It's kind of like educating people to listen.
So how can you listen to your favorite city? Apart from Brian Eno's ambient music and the concept of deep listening pioneered by the avant-garde composer Pauline Oliveros that Nick was mentioning, you can tune into the city live through the work of Canadian composer and writer R. Murray Schafer. After all, it was him who coined the term soundscape, a landscape made of sounds, and pioneered the art of listening to urban environments. His work laid the foundation for acoustic ecology, encouraging us to consider not just how cities look, but how they sound, and how sounds around us can reveal the character and health of a city. More recently, musician and philosopher David Rothenberg spent 5 years playing live music with nightingales in Berlin, deepening the understanding between various forms of life that inhabit the city together. Back in Tokyo, it's perhaps no wonder that riding the Yamanote line, you'll spot train buffs, YouTubers and sound artists alike trying to catch a glimpse of the melodies before they vanish into the oblivion of Tokyo's soundscape just moments before the next train arrives. But if you listen carefully, you can unlock another level of the city experience and even hear some unexpected Tokyo features like the ocean waves, the hum of birds and insects, or trees rustling their branches in the wind. Sounds shape cities more than we often realize. As composer John Cage once said, there is no such thing as silence. From Monocle in Tokyo, I'm Alexandra Streltsova.
Well, that's all we've got time for on this week's edition of The Curator. The show was produced by David Stevens and presented by me, Carlotta Rebello. Join us again next week to hear some of the very best of the programmes here on Monocle Radio. Goodbye and thanks for listening.